It depends on what part you want to say. Now, my name is Ida Margaret Bishop, but I was Edwards. But I am from the family of the McGuinness family of Darwin. That's where I was born.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us how you came to know about Xavier Herbert?
Oh, Xavier Herbert made a great friend of my Uncle Val, because Val was great at telling stories of what was happening. He kept it all in his head, and Xavier and he were very good friends.
Mm-hmm.
They used to say Xavier, but it's, just for fun.
Yes.
Yeah, all right.
And how did you meet Xavier? Do you remember when you first met him?
I think I only met him once, and I think because he approached me, I wouldn't have known him at the pub, but he knew who I was, because Val had said who I was.
Mm-hmm.
So I found it very interesting to meet him, because I'm interested in writing myself.
Right. And what did you talk about with Xavier?
I don't know. Probably just things that he talked about. My grandmother, she was the queen, and then when Granny went, I inherited her position, so that when anything happened, they always had to refer to me, and I'd say, what are the others saying? I wouldn't make the decision myself. I'd say, they've got to make that decision, and then when I hear what their decision is, if it's okay, it's okay.
Mm-hmm. And Ida, can you explain to people a little bit about the McGuinness family and how you...
Oh, because they got that nickname, the McGuinness, from the Finniss, because that's where they were, around the Finniss River. And I think the original McGuinness was an Irishman, and you remember in those early days the Irish got a very bad handling in England.
Mm-hmm.
They were, I don't know why it was, but they migrated. And of course they made it very well in other countries, and everybody liked them very much. They made friends, they had things to offer, different ways of cooking and all that sort of thing.
Right.
So they got known as the McGuinness from the Finniss.
And Lucy, your great-grandmother, or was it grandmother?
No, Lucy was my mother's mother, so she was my granny.
Right. So your granny, do you want to explain who she was?
Well, she was married to... oh gosh, this is a long time ago now.
Steve McGuinness, wasn't it?
Steve McGuinness, that's right. You know more than I remember more than I do.
Yeah.
Yes, Stephen McGuinness. He was an Irishman.
Yes.
And so our family tended to go towards the Irish way. And as a family, they stuck together. They knew who was from where and what generation. They had it all in their head.
And your father was a friend of Steve's, a mate of his?
Yes, excuse me, pardon me. Yes, my father was more...
What was his name?
Gilbert Henry Langdon Edwards. He was a Langdon. The Langdon, remember, was Captain William Langdon, was an explorer that came down from the Europe. Mm-hmm. And so that's how Dad got the Langdons. The Langdons married in, and so my dad was very brainy.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he took up, what do you call it? Hammer in the...
Mining?
No, not mining.
Fettler, was he?
No, things, looking up to machines and getting things together like that. He's very clever. He could see something is wrong, all right, fix it up like this, put a screw in, everything. It was okay.
Right.
Okay. And he was very brainy too. He said to me, learn, don't give up learning. So I never did. I thought he was wonderful, so I did what he told me.
And your granny, Lucy, she ended up in the Kahlin Compound?
Yes, but when he married her, he got the permission to marry her, and nobody dared touch her because it was Steve McGuinness's wife, and so she had a monopoly there of being the queen of the Koongurrukun.
But he died. Stephen died.
Yes, I think he had a heart problem. Whether the atmosphere was not good for him, but I think he used to do very heavy work because he was an engineer, you know, when you come to boil it down. And so he was doing heavy things that he shouldn't have been doing, put too much strain on his heart, and that was the end of Grandfather McGuinness. But he left something with his sons that they carried on, the things that he told them. And that's why they reckon the McGuinnesses made their way, because they remembered what their father had said and they did it.
And one of these sons was Val. Do you want to?
Yes.
The other one?
Well, because they were Roman Catholic too, they took the names, saints' names. Valentine. My mum was Margaret. She was St Margaret. He was St Valentine. There was St Joseph. Joe was one of them. So they all got the Irish saints' names.
Good Catholics.
Yes, good Catholics.
And Lucy, my understanding is Lucy ended up in the Kahlin Compound because she wouldn't leave her two young ones there on their own. Is that correct?
I don't know what it was. I can't. Mum used to tell me about that. We used to upset her quite a bit to talk about it. So she didn't have to go into the compound, but because there were people there, say her brother or whatever it was, she would go and visit them. It was always very hard to get past what the English fellows were doing, you know. It was very hard in those days. There was a level of society, that's all I can call it, sort of down here, and you had to work up here and you stayed there.
So class
conscious,
distinction.
Yes. Yes. And when my dad was there, he wouldn't have anything of it. If someone said, "Oh, we can't serve that because she's an Abbo," he said, "Excuse me, what were you saying?" "He's an Abbo." He said, "What do you mean by Abbo?" He'd make them say what they were saying. He says, "Where did you come from? Where were you born?" "Oh, so you must have been a so-and-so." He said, "No." You know, he turned the tables.
Right.
I often think about that. I think, oh, gee, I wish I'd been there to watch it.
Right.
But Dad used to say to me, never let anybody put you down. Know who you are and what you're capable of and do it. So,
which is a great
easy.
lesson. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And what did your dad do?
Well, my dad just about did everything, but he was what did you call it? I did know.
A machinist?
No, what they did, he did with machines. He could, a mechanic. He was more mechanical.
Mm-hmm.
He was a mechanic when they were slowly coming up with all those different things. But he could mould things. He could make something. So he made things. And he had it up here. I think I got a little bit of his brain, but only a little bit.
Can you tell us about, we call him Uncle Val? Would it be Uncle Val?
Yes, Valentine Bino.
Yeah.
He was born in Bino Harbour. So he got Valentine, because they were Roman Catholic by religion, they got the saints' names.
Yeah.
There was St Joseph, St Valentine, St Barnabas, there was Barney, how they went. And Mum got Margaret, she was St Margaret. So I just got Ida, plain Ida. That was one.
Well, what was Margaret like, your mother?
Oh, she was lovely. We were like sisters more than mum and daughter.
Mm-hmm.
We'd sit there and we'd laugh about the same things. We'd go into hysterics about things, you know. So I was really down when she died, you know. I thought, who have I got now who understands me? But it all worked out. I've got a lovely husband.
And can you tell us about how the book came about?
Oh, I don't quite know how. I think one of the girls, there was a group of people who dealt with Aboriginal people. Oh, what's the name of it? Can't even think.
Don't worry about that because it's all explained in the book anyway, and I can use that.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
It was the Aboriginal Development Commission or something like that, and so she always reminded us. I said, "Oh, I don't know whether she should keep on trying, keep on." Yes, but it mightn't be good. Now, how do you know it's not going to be good? So that sort of bolstered me up a bit.
So you had support, but what made you want to do it? What drove you to do it?
I think my mum said, she said, well, there's very few of us now remember the language. She said, can you write it down? She didn't want to tackle it. So I used to tackle it down. I'd say, how would I write this down to make it sound? Does this sound all right? I'm trying her out, you see. And so then that was how my first language book came out.
So you, and at that stage when you were doing it, you didn't actually, did you speak the language fluently or did you have to learn it yourself?
No, I did understand it from them. I didn't understand the whole value of it. But when they were talking to me, I knew what they were saying. I could translate it. But I was not, I couldn't say blah, 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 like this.
So for somebody that knew nothing about the Koongurrukun people, can you explain who the Koongurrukun people are?
Now, hang on, before. Kung, Ara, go on.
Kung,
Ara,
Ara,
Kan.
Kan.
That's right.
Kun, Ara, Kan.
Not Kun, Kung,
Kung,
Ara,
Ara,
Kan.
Kan.
Say it quickly. Kung,
Kung,
Ara, Kan. Good.
Yep.
You got it. By George, he's got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Explain who the Koongurrukun people are. Koongurrukun people.
If you think of the first bit as Kung,
Yeah.
I'm going to, like, no, I can't think of any
Yeah,
word.
it
We'll
doesn't-
talk about it afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, go on. What's the rest?
Tell me who the Koongurrukun people are.
Ah, well, they migrated as far as I could find out. You know how Europe came down like that, and there were the straits coming down, and then the top of Darwin. I think they were under persecution up there, and they mainly the Roman Catholics. You remember that time when they had to get away because the Roman Catholics didn't get anywhere. So they came down. They made their own little boats and things like that, and they crossed that.
Venus River?
Yeah, no, it wasn't the Finniss River. It was like a.
Oh, the Strait, the East Timor Sea.
The Straits.
Yeah, the Strait there. Yeah.
Yes, they crossed there. On floaty rocks or anything. They could make their own boats anyway. So they come to the Northern Territory. That's how they came through. And I think when different people, you know how the Irish had to, the English were not happy with the Irish, and they were sort of outcasts. So they weren't Church of England, they were Roman Catholic, whatever. So they were sort of outcast too.
From?
So
Outcast from where?
we're from England, you know.
Oh, yeah.
So
I mean, the Koongurrukun, who were they outcast from? From other Aboriginal tribes, you mean?
No, mainly from Europeans.
Uh-huh.
And of course, Europeans thought they didn't have any brains. Oh, I haven't got any brains. But when it came to getting advice on something, they had to come and they would get advice. And so after a while, they learned to respect the value of their knowledge. And so a lot of them have risen up. They've got good jobs and everything now. They still have to fight, you know.
For everything.
Yes, things as, they're only an abo, you know.
Why are they known as the paperbark people?
Oh, because that's where the paperbarks were growing. Paperbarks grow where there's water, fresh water, and so they would make babies' things out of the paperbark. They would, part of their blankets have a paperbark on them. The paperbark leaves were good in cooking. It was like a herb. So there's lots of things that paperbacks could be used for. So they was known as the paperback people. They didn't get on much with the saltwater people. No.
The saltwater people are the Larrikin people? Are they the people in Darwin? Or?
I've sort of gone away from what they were.
Oh, the Warra people.
The Warra, they were another breed. And at one stage they were against each other. And I think when circumstances changed, they had to go together because...
That was during the land claim in the...
Yes, I don't know. That was very hard, you know. There's all of that land claim business, and our people used to say, "Why have we got to claim our own land? This is our land. Why do we have to claim it?" I said, "Well, because that's what's happened. That white man has come in. He reckons it's his country. It's not his country." They say, you know. But it'd be hard to do.
And they managed to get 3 parcels of it back in the 70s, or early 80s actually.
Oh, yes, yes.
That's when Xavier Herbert gave evidence in support of
Xavier, they just worshipped Xavier. He was their saviour. He was a wonderful man, you know.
Would you explain what the name you gave Xavier Herbert within the Kungarakan people? It was
Numeyook.
Numeyook.
Yeah. Numeyook is old man.
Right.
He's a Numeyook, and if he's a Numeyook, he's the head of the thing. He's the senior.
Right.
Almeyook is his wife.
Sadie.
They call me Almeyook because I'm the senior female left standing. So they say, "Hey, they're going to Almeyook," and they say, "Hello," and you know,
So it's a mark of respect.
Oh yes, but it's old woman, you know. You might say in English it's old madam or something like that. And Koongurrukun is woman.
Right.
If you're just a woman, you're a Koongurrukun.
And Numeyook is the man.
Numeyook, that's right, is the old man, and Almeyook is the old woman. Numeyook, Almeyook.
But there's an element of elder as in special, someone with wisdom or someone who's close to the people. Does it mean that too?
No, there were names for... I've forgotten some of these things. I've got nobody to talk to. When I had Mum, I'd say, "Mum, what's so-and-so?" And she'd tell me, but I've got nobody who can refresh my memory. And so Meg, my eldest, you've met Meg, have you? She'd ask me, I said, "Oh, Meg, gosh." I said, "If we had Nana here, we'd be able to find out."
Yes.
But I had a book. Did I? You saw my... That's it. It's all the things are in there. I think I've got... And I'm glad I put those things in because I would have forgotten some of those things now. I've got nobody to talk to. Mum used to say to me, "Talk to me, tell me, talk to me in the language." I said, "I don't know how." And she'd say, "Come on, we'll do it." And she'd get me back into it. She said, "Then we don't forget. If we talk to each other like that, we won't forget."
And why is it important for people to keep their language?
Well, I don't know. It's like you get settled with, say, your old house where you were born. So if you remember the house where you were born, it's got some special thing for you. That's where you first saw the light of day. So it's got nothing else. It doesn't run out and kiss you hello and kiss you goodbye. It's just a part of history.
A connection.
Yes, history of your life. And I said to Graham the other day, I said, I've got nobody to talk to. I said, nobody understands the language. I can't talk to anybody. And I said, the only one I can get is Meg. And I said, and I have to get her, and she'd be very good. She'd like to. You know, and I said, and then we can talk. She's wanted to do it. So, but she lives somewhere else and I live somewhere else. You can't jump around. But when we do, I said, come on, let's go and say. And she'd say, well, what do you call this and what do you call that? And if I don't have it, I'll forget it.
I'm Sean Monahan and I come originally from England. In 1977, I arrived in Perth to take up a job at Secondary Teachers College. And it was there, after about a year, that I first discovered the works of Xavier Herbert. Initially, unlike most people I think, I started with Poor Fellow My Country rather than Capricornia. And the way it happened was that I was an Englishman. I was coming to teach English in an Australian college, so I thought I really ought to find out something about Australian literature. And what I did was, I'm a very keen novel reader. I also like plays and poetry, but mostly I just went to the shelves of, in that college we had a section for Australian literature, and I just went and took books off the shelves and read them in a sort of higgledy-piggledy sort of a way. And I think it took me about 8 months before I finally took off the shelves this enormous book, which was interesting just because it was big, and read it. And as I've said to many people since, I was just bowled over by it in a way that I've never, that I had not been bowled over by any of the other Australian literature I'd read, which by then included most of the well-known figures in Australian literature. So that's where it all started for me.
Just moved a bit.
Sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. Don't worry. That's okay. So, would you like to explain what it was about Poor Fellow My Country that bowled you over?
Yeah, it was a number of things. Let's start with the simplest. I, in a way, am a very traditional story reader. I like stories. I like wanting to know what happens next. I like getting involved in the characters to the extent of wanting the good ones to succeed and the bad ones to fail. So it had all of that. It was just a fantastic story. It's very big. I think I was trying to work out the other day how many times I read it. I think at least 5 times now. So as a story, first of all. But secondly, and I've heard this from other people in my own position, like many people who've come to Australia and found it, as you do when you go to any new country, you find all sorts of strange things about it. And I've heard from many people that the thing that appealed to them about both Capricornia and Poor Fellow My Country is that it helped them to recognise, at least, and to understand things about Australia that just seemed weird. To Australians they seemed quite normal, but they just seem weird when you arrive in Australia.
Could you speak about those?
Yeah, there are all sorts of things, some small, some big, but for me, one of the strangest things was that on the one hand, the really attractive thing about Australia and Australians, to me, was that they seemed to be so independent, so self-assured in their private lives anyway. Well, for instance, in England, none of my circle of middle-class teachers would consider breaking out of teaching and going and starting up a business because they suddenly had the idea to do that. Where I now was in Australia, this sort of thing happened, and it was attractive. I also liked the rejection, apparently, of the colonial master, you know, the bloody Poms and all that sort of stuff. And yet, on the other hand, I went to, I still remember it, going to a hockey match and watching the audience of Australians stand up for the British national anthem. And I thought, what's happening here? I mean, I hadn't stood for the British national anthem for years back in England, and here they were doing it here. And really strange was, at that time, there was talk about changing the Australian flag to take out the Union Jack. And it didn't surprise me that there was some opposition to this. It was the nature of the opposition that surprised me, that the people who were really obviously dyed-in-the-wool patriots, the ones I would have expected to be arguing for getting rid of the British flag, were the ones who were arguing against it and saying this was an un-Australian thing to do. Now, to a newcomer, that was weird. You couldn't understand that. That's the most obvious example of the kind of thing that I found particularly strange. I mean, there were all sorts of other smaller things. Not all of them were contradictions of that sort. One that I've never actually talked about and I didn't write about in my book because I thought it was too personal, but was the where I'd come from, sort of academic background I come from in England, there was a sort of unease about talking about intellectual things that I didn't find in this Australian college that I'd landed at. People talked about the houses, the real estate they were buying, and they talked about the footy. But anyone talking about intellectual things, you just sort of didn't do it. And when you did, you sort of were a bit shamefaced almost about doing it. Now, I can't tell you quite where in Poor Fellow My Country that came across to me, but it did somehow. That sort of thing. It was just the whole Australian character seemed to me to be encapsulated partly in the character of de Lacy, but just throughout the book there were things that I had sort of sensed or directly recognised in my life here in Perth in that first year or two that I saw in Poor Fellow My Country in a way that I hadn't seen in the other novels that I'd been reading. And incidentally, that one thing sorry, I'm out of camera again, but I have a little letter here from a friend of mine in Canberra who also became interested in Xavier Herbert and is also from outside Australia originally, and she said, she wrote to me after I'd written my book, and she said, your account in your introduction of the impact of Poor Fellow My Country, and also for me Capricornia, on a newcomer to Australia is exactly how I felt, and often still feel. And I think that you'd find that with many people who come from outside Australia and who are bowled over by Poor Fellow My Country.
And yet you also, when you found Xavier Herbert and found this great writer, you also found people who didn't think he was that good in the academic area. Yeah. And I think he's been bedeviled by this kind of mixed reaction right from way back to Capricornia, but even more so with Poor Fellow My Country. In fact, while there were a couple of strong champions of that book, Laurie Hergenhan was one and Harry Heseltine was another, they were certainly
I would say, outnumbered by people who are very, very strongly critical of the book, who didn't see what it was about, who didn't like it at all, who thought it was too long, who thought it was badly written, who themselves were, in my view, totally wrong about this book.
So you said about trying to correct this perspective by writing your own book.
Yeah.
Would you like to explain to people how that came about?
Yeah. That was certainly one of the strong motivations for my book. And the book came about, it started a long time ago, back in the late 70s, because I arrived in 77, so by about, I can't remember now exactly, but certainly by 79 I would have had the idea of doing something on Xavier Herbert in response to the kind of negativity that I had I'd had directly from more than one of the people who had written these bad articles about Poor Fellow My Country. So I knew I wanted to do something. I wasn't exactly sure what. I started reading the other books, of course. I started with Poor Fellow My Country. I then went to Capricornia. I'm not quite sure what the order from then on was, but over the time I read all the other books as well. And it started by, I decided that I would write an article on Capricornia, was the first one I wrote, and had that published in a literary magazine here in Australia, which was my first literary magazine publication, so that was good. And I thought there might be some response to that, and there was none. And as I say, I can't remember exactly how quickly it turned into, yes, I'm going to write a book, but that is what it did turn into. And from between 1980, roughly, and 2000, roughly, so about 20 years, which included one full-time year of study where I managed to get time off and paid for time off and so on. And then a couple of other 3-month stints where I got time off. And then I retired early, and so I had another 4 or 5 years, which was pretty much solely devoted, when I wasn't doing other things, to Xavier Herbert. I was trying to work out, well, I was trying to do two things really. One, I was trying to get as fully and clearly as I could down onto paper what it was that made Poor Fellow My Country, in my view, one of the great novels of the world. And that was one of the things that I wanted to do. And secondly, it was because, having read all the other books and also in the fullness of time getting to read quite a lot of what I'd read all Xavier's articles, and I was able during one period of study leave to read many of his letters, I began to really get puzzled over all sorts of questions connected with, this guy has so many apparent weaknesses as a writer, and even in his own character there seemed to be certain things that would make him one of the less likely candidates for writing good fiction. And in the middle period of his career, he wrote such awful stuff. There are all sorts of questions here. How did he write two such, well, one very good first novel, and, as I've said more than once now, one amazing final novel? How did he do it? So that was really the second motivation for all the work that I wanted to put in on Xavier Herbert.
So why is Poor Fellow My Country right up there amongst the best books ever written, in your opinion?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that it does something that I am not sure has ever been attempted before, and if it has been, I haven't read it, and if it, therefore, it's something not only that attempted something that has never been attempted, it then actually achieved it. And that thing was to create within the form of the novel a rich picture of a country that includes not only the nuts and bolts little details of the physical life of the country, including such things as the precise workings of the particular trains that run through the Northern Territory, down to the very smallest nut and bolt, which he spends about 2 or 3 pages on in one part of Poor Fellow My Country. Not only that, not only things like the different prejudices that you find in Australia, such as at one point where he talks about the prejudice against anyone who carries a knife in Australia, all kinds of tiny little practical details about Australian life. Of course, Australian life at a particular time and in a particular place, but nonetheless quintessentially Australian. But it doesn't just do that, it also portrays, I think, very richly the Australian character. Again, certain aspects of the character, no doubt, are missed out, but it's amazingly diverse, I think, the picture given of the Australian character. And then what Xavier himself constantly referred to as the ethos of Australia, and that's what he was dealing with, the sort of spirit of Australia, the heart of Australia, what Australia was intended to be about originally, with its founding fathers and its ideals at that time, what it perhaps has never quite been, but what Xavier thought it should be and could be. So the book includes all of that. It also includes within it both a tragedy and a romance. The tragedy in the book is the tragedy of the failure of Australia. That's why he called it Poor Fellow My Country. As he explains it, Poor Fellow My Country is what the Aboriginal sings at the deepest sadness for the loss of country. It's certainly what the main character in the book, Bob Wiradjuri, sings at those points when he feels that he is furthest away from achieving the success that he wants to achieve. The success that he wants to achieve, incidentally, being symbolic of the success that Xavier wants Australia to achieve. And I've lost my train. I can't remember where I was going there. But to summarise that this book is great, firstly, because it manages to get all that richness into one book. Now, when you come to examine how it does that, you come to me, another greater aspect of its greatness, which paradoxically, I think, is one of the reasons why it hasn't received its due reward from the critics. And that is, I think it is amazingly experimental in its use of genre, and so experimental in its use of genre that one of the reasons it's been criticised is because, well, certainly until my book came out, that originality was not even recognised. Now that I've managed to my own satisfaction anyway, describe that complexity of genre use, there is no excuse for anyone not at least to consider it. And part of the greatness of the book is that experiment was largely successful, and it was because it was successful that he was able to do this amazing thing, to catch in the in the pages of a novel that is enormously readable just by being what traditionally a novel always was, a good plot and good characters and so on, but as well as doing that, I mean, it's not a sociological thesis, this book, it's a good novel, but as well as being that, it's also as rich a picture of a culture, this culture of ours, of Australia, as I think you can find in any book on Australia. I don't think you'll find a better picture of Australia in a sociological treatise or in a history book, because Poor Fellow My Country includes the sociology of Australia. It includes the history of Australia. And one reason it can include it is because he was inspired enough to move to genres which allowed him to do that. One of those genres was, well, can I talk about those genres now? Okay. I'm indebted to another much greater critic than myself for the explanation of these genres. The critic was Northrop Frye, who I believe was Canadian. I may be wrong about that. And he wrote a great work of criticism in which he pointed out that the problem for some writers of prose fiction is that prose fiction is always called the novel. And the problem with that for some writers of prose fiction is that the novel tends to be associated with certain novelists, such as, sort of archetypally almost, Henry James, Jane Austen, that sort of novelist, who wrote, E.M. Forster, I suppose, another classic case, who wrote novels in which certain things were expected by readers. And of course any reader coming to any work of fiction comes with certain preconceptions, and the writer either works with those preconceptions or against them. Now the preconception that you approach a writer like Henry James or Jane Austen with are things like they do not lecture you, they do not give you long speeches. You do not get two characters spending 4 or 5 pages debating certain issues, however important they may be to the novel. They don't even explain their own feelings, because to do so would be unnatural within the conventions of the novel, because within real life we tend, although in real life we actually quite often do explain ourselves. So there are all kinds of conventions that you accept when you come to read that sort of novel. And I personally love those conventions. I have nothing against them whatsoever. But what Northrop Frye said was that to judge every work of prose fiction like that immediately cuts out certain works of prose fiction that history, that has over time have proven themselves to be worthy works of prose fiction. For instance, Gulliver's Travels. For instance, The Water Babies. For instance, Les Miserables, the French novel. For instance, Pantagruel and Gargantua. These are works of prose fiction, but they break all the rules of Jane Austen and Henry James. So what Northrop Frye did, he said, well, I'm tired of this. I'm going to examine as many works of fiction as I can throughout all the ages, and I'm going to try and come up with some better, more accurate definitions, see whether I can divide it into a rather more helpful set, rather than to lump them all under this one label, novel. So he came up with 4 major genres of prose fiction. One of them he called novel, and that was and that described the sort of novel that we've been talking about. The 3 others he called confession, and what he was talking about there was what we call biography, which he said was a certain kind of fiction anyway. I don't know why he called it confession. It would have been simpler to call it biography like he called novel, but anyway, he called it confession, which he took from the Confessions of St. Augustine. The other 2, one of them we I think have a pretty good idea what he was talking about, romance. And he was talking about both these sort of popular romances that we know from Boy's Own Paper and that kind of thing, and also classical romances like King Arthur and so on.
Adventure stories.
Yeah. Adventure stories are very much the sort of popular level of romance. It goes on a whole continuum right up to the most sort of flowery of medieval kind of romance. And then finally this one that he called The Anatomy, which again he got from the name of a book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, by Burton back in the 17th century. The useful thing was not just dividing, he then described the qualities of these things. And I read that, obviously, before I read Poor Fellow My Country. I don't know when the connection between them came to me. Thank goodness it did. Because when I then was looking at Poor Fellow My Country to work out how it worked, first of all I found that many of the things it was being criticised for were both things that were described by Fry as conventions of the anatomy. That was one thing I noticed about them, and I'll tell you in a second what those things were. But the second thing I noticed about them was that they were also the things that enabled him to produce at least part of this rich picture of Australia that fascinated me. That part that dealt with the history of Australia was largely possible. He was able to convey that, as he did, through the conventions of the anatomy. That part of the picture that dealt with all the nitty-gritty little things about Australia, that came from what the convention, as Fry described it, he said that in anatomy there is the sort of, like the magpie or jackdaw that's always collecting little bits here and there and everywhere. He said that in the anatomy there is this sort of encyclopedist urge to just collect everything and to put it all in. And that's very much on one level what Poor Fellow My Country is. Everything that Xavier ever thought about Australia, ever saw in Australia. And I've just been told today how interested he was. That was something I didn't know about him. The people who really knew him, as I never did, said he was always interested in the minutiae of things around him. Well, that's what an anatomist does. So that's one thing. Another aspect of anatomy that Fry describes, he calls symposium discussion, going back to the Platonic dialogues, where and also going to things like Aldous Huxley's novels earlier in last century, where people sat around discussing things for interest. Well, if you read Poor Fellow My Country, you've got to pretty soon get used to the fact that Jeremy de Lacy loves sitting around discussing things with somebody else. And he's using something that in fact Swift used in Gulliver's Travels, which is another very famous anatomy. What I call in my own writing the stranger in a strange land sort of motif, where in Gulliver's Travels, Gulliver arrives in a new country, and it's very natural within that setting for him to find someone who's prepared to initiate him into the mores of this new country. And so long conversations about how things work and what people believe and so on become very natural within that sort of setting. In Poor Fellow My Country, Xavier not only uses this because it's a very good way of allowing him to discuss all sorts of things, and thus to give to us, the reader, all kinds of his insights into Australia and just factual information about the history and so on of Australia. So it's a very good way for him to do that. So it was a very sensible thing for him to actually choose the anatomy technique to use. Why it's so unfair that he's very often criticised for doing it. Why? Because it doesn't fit what the novel says you should do. And it's unfair, first of all, because he wasn't trying at those points of the book, to write novel-type dialogue. He was writing a different sort of dialogue. So that's the first reason it's unfair. It's unfair, secondly, because when you look at the way he has structured those and written those symposium dialogues, he's actually done it very carefully and very cleverly in order to make it as palatable as possible for people who aren't yet used to it, who are used to the different sort of dialogue that comes in the novel. And so he's first of all criticised for simply doing it, because you're not allowed to do this in a novel, which is nonsense, which is limiting, as Fry said, it's limiting the prose fiction to a very narrow field. And secondly, since they're not prepared to even accept that he can do it, they never get as far, these critics, to looking at how well he has done it. And when you do analyse one of these, take the very first one, in which, for instance, he deals with all sorts of things that are crucial not only to the novel but to Australia, things such as the treatment of Aboriginals, the history of the treatment of Aboriginals, things like the development of the meat trade in the Northern Territory, all sorts of things he deals with in that first dialogue, which takes place over 20 pages probably. So if you're not used to it, you've got to get used to it fairly fast. But he structures it and organises it carefully so that he does a number of things. First of all, he breaks it up and has breaks in between it where things happen. Secondly, he includes within the dialogue actually two purely narrative stories which are interesting in themselves. So that even if you get a bit tired with all the information on Aboriginals, which incidentally I didn't, and I'm sure that people who don't know much about Australia wouldn't, and that's why we responded to this book. But you've still got other things that can keep your interest during it. Now that's clever. I mean, that's clever to first of all work out. It sounds as if I'm coming at it from the critic who comes to it after the event, and I worked out how it works. I'm not saying, and I don't think, that Xavier sat down and thought, how can I do this? Ah, yes, I can use this convention, which, and I'm certainly sure he'd never even heard of the Anatomy or Northrop Frye. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. In fact, when we come on to looking at how Xavier actually wrote, I'm sure that he didn't work things out in that kind of forefront of the brain kind of thinking. But the fact is, he did manage to fall upon this answer to this particular novelistic problem. How do I get across all this stuff while still holding on to my reader's interest, while still covering everything I want to cover in this book? And he managed to do it. And with the exception of my own book, I don't think he's ever been given any credit for doing that. Whereas, go across to other countries, you get something like James Joyce's Ulysses, which is a far more impenetrable book than Poor Fellow My Country, far harder to read, which is also has a lot of the anatomy in it, which has also therefore received a lot of the same sort of criticism in its early days. But nonetheless, Ireland and England haven't allowed it the ignominy of going out of print and of simply being disregarded by its own academia, which has happened to Poor Fellow My Country.
So, moving on then, tell us how you think Xavier, what particular techniques he used or strategies he used to create Poor Fellow My Country.
Yeah.
How did he go about writing?
Yeah. In a very, for me, very fascinating way. I don't know if this is a usual way for authors, because I haven't done much reading about how other authors wrote. But I'll tell you the process, and then if you can remind me if I forget, I'd like to say a word about why it was really important to him in Poor Fellow My Country, and what happened to him when he didn't follow this process, or at least didn't follow it successfully. Okay, the process was you could call it sort of inspirational, ecstatic, in ways that more prosaic people like myself could even find rather funny, and sometimes reading about them I did find them rather funny, but there's no question that this is how he wrote, and it was as follows. He had a very clear set of steps which he always followed, or certainly by the time he was writing Poor Fellow My Country, he had worked out that these were the ways that he could write. And they were these. First of all, it always started with extreme physical exertion. At one period of his career, this was chopping endless amounts of wood. At the stage where he was writing Poor Fellow My Country, it was running fast until he was exhausted, until he was tired out. This was the starting point. And it had to be the starting point. There's a lovely story that comes in one of his letters when he's describing how he's driving along the road in his ute. And he suddenly felt the inspiration coming on. But he writes in his letter, but I knew that it always has to start with the running. So what does he do? He doesn't want to waste the inspiration being something for the next bit of his book. So he stops the ute, side of the road. I think he put on his running shorts. Whether or not he did that, can't quite remember, but certainly he put on his running shoes and head off down the road. He was at this time about 67 or more, so you get this late 60s guy, grey head, thundering down the road, because he knew that the first stage always had to be the exertion of the walk. The second stage, and I don't think he did it on that occasion because I don't think he could have done it, but the second stage was not to start writing immediately after that. What he said was during the run, he could feel his mind start to he often talked about it in terms of gold. The gold stream would start running in his mind. And that was the idea for what was going to come next in Poor Fellow My Country. And that would start sometime during this exertion. But when he stopped, he normally didn't then start writing. In fact, let's go back to the more normal procedure, which he describes day by day over a period of 8 months when he was working in hospital in Innisfail. He wrote a letter every night to his wife in which he described what was happening to his book, which he wrote sort of in the chinks between having to do his pharmacist work. And so the normal procedure was this. He would go out to the local field and run 1 or 2 or 3 miles. Then he would go back home. He would have a simple meal, which he'd cook for himself, and then he'd go to sleep. And here we come to the second part of the process, which was absolutely vital, according to him, and that was the dreaming. Because what the golden stream that had been started in the running couldn't be used until it had been, as he himself said, dreamt over. So he went to sleep, and he slept from about 8:39 until about 12 o'clock. So 3 or 4 hours he would sleep. And then he would wake up. And when he woke up, it was the time to write. But it had to be the inspired writing. And he didn't want to waste any of the inspiration. He talked about it in terms of inspiration or the genius. And he knew when it was upon him. And he knew that he had a sort of almost holy duty not to waste it. And so what he first did was to actually write. So there was this guy, he had to go to his pharmacy work next day, but he was waking up in the middle of the night, and the first thing he did was to write to his wife, Zadie. Not about anything that was interesting to Zadie, really, because wherever he talked about the personal things, he would be talking about his amours, or what he thought were his amours with the female staff of the hospital. Nothing you would have thought Zadie would really want to hear about. But most of those letters were spent in writing about the book, how it was getting on, what he was doing, trying to work out why he was doing it. And the letters, sometimes, they were always at least 4 pages, sometimes 5, sometimes 6, sometimes I think a bit more. And it was interesting that once or twice in those letters he said to Sadie, I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing or whether I'm wasting the genius. But no, he said, I don't think I am. I think when I'm writing to you, I'm not really using the genius yet, so it's okay for me to write. And in fact, he said, I think it's good for me because I'm sort of warming up to where I'm really ready. So when he got to the point when he was really ready, he'd run, it had all been dreamt over, he'd warmed himself up by writing to Sadie, which was a boon to a researcher such as myself, because I learnt for eight months about everything that was going through his mind as he was writing Poor Fellow My Country. Then, when he got to that stage, he was ready. He would then write, and he would write without any corrections for an hour or 2 hours, and then he'd stop, go back to sleep until he had to get up next morning, and then at lunchtime the following day he would look again at what he'd written in the night, and he would revise it, and then that was it. I said I was going to say something about why that was important to him. Yeah, and one of the things that I found more and more interesting as I was researching for and writing my book was not the thing that had initially started me off on it, and which still remained my prime interest, which was to try to get to the full truth of the greatness of Poor Fellow My Country and of Capricornia, which I also thought had been well praised but had not been fully understood. So that still remained the prime task. But the other thing that began to interest me was simply how did he manage to do it when he had in so many ways a number of handicaps, and also when, having written his great first novel in his 30s, it wasn't until he was 67 that he started writing his final and even greater novel. What was he doing between 35 and 65, 30 years? You might think he was working. No, he wasn't, because he hated having to leave his writing. He always resisted it when, as far as I know, from my reading anyway of his letters, when Sadie occasionally tried to get him to go out and do some work, which I think she was forced to sometimes, and I'm guessing here. But certainly when he went to work as a pharmacist, he didn't want to, because he was in the middle of writing Poor Fellow My Country, and he only did it for the money. So between those 30 years, he wasn't doing another job. He was meant to be writing, apart from a short time in the army. He was meant to be writing, and indeed he was writing, largely, almost solely, in fact, in my view, unsuccessfully. He wrote an appalling novel called The Little Widow, which was never published, thankfully, for the reading public. It was just terrible. And the one that was published, the big one that was published, Soldiers' Women, was, although I, as a researcher, found it very interesting to see how within it he was sort of, through making all kinds of mistakes, was learning things that became important when he, having learnt them, when he came to his final book. But in terms of its absolute quality, I think it was really very bad. And the other book he wrote, called Seven Emus, which was a very short, really a novella, not a novel, which was also to the researcher very interesting, because he learnt some very important things that, as far as Poor Fellow My Country was concerned, in writing that book. However, as a book in itself, nobody except someone who was interested in Herbert, I think, would particularly want to read it. It's not as ghastly as Soldiers' Women is ghastly, but it's a very slight work. So it was really interesting to me to find out, why did that happen? I mean, he had written a very, very good book. I don't think Capricornia is as good as Poor Fellow My Country, but it was only his first novel, so you don't expect it to be as good. And it was certainly a very, very good first novel, and deserves its place as one of the classics of Australian literature. So how come he then spent 30 years writing what I don't think anyone would claim was particularly good, what I would bluntly say is pretty much rubbish? That's a bit unfair, but it's not good. So one of the answers to that question, and it's only one of the answers, but one of the answers to that question is that he was trying to be too consciously clever a writer. And he was not, I think, a fantastically clever person. And you don't need to be a fantastically clever person to write a novel. But secondly, he simply did not write well when he was conscious of precisely what he was trying to do. It just didn't work, and that's what Soldiers' Women shows. That again, he was writing a romance, which he was one absolutely central part of Poor Fellow My Country is a wonderful romance in which the hero is the young Aboriginal boy Prindy. So Soldiers' Women was a romance in one sense. It didn't, again, as romance often does, it was an allegorical romance. So the allegory was all important in Soldiers' Women. The allegory there was concerned with beliefs about gender roles and sexual roles and so on. The allegory in Poor Fellow My Country is concerned with the development of Australia and what Australia could and should and might have become. So they were parallel books in that sense. It didn't have the strong confession elements. But in this central aspect, they were parallel. So why was the allegory so flat in Soldiers' Women? Why was the romance so unconvincing in Soldiers' Women, whereas the romance, which after all is not a 20th century, except in the very adventure story kind of romance. The kind of romance he was writing in Poor Fellow My Country and Soldiers' Women was high romance, which had its strongest vogue probably back in the medieval period. Pretty hard to do that successfully in the 20th century, yet the romance of Poor Fellow My Country, yet another of its great points. I doubt that you could find another romance that has been written in the 20th century that betters it simply as a romance. But it didn't work in Soldiers' Women. One reason, I think, was because the ideas that he was working with, these gender ideas and sexual ideas, were not good ones to work with. They were not convincing. They were not rich ideas.
So this gets to your first thing about deep purpose. But once he got to his deep purpose,
yeah,
he was more on track.
Yeah.
And would you like to explain what you think his deep purpose was?
Yeah.
In both those successful novels?
Yeah. And incidentally, he thought in Soldiers' Women he was dealing with one of his deep purposes because he passionately believed in his views on sexuality and gender.
Yeah.
But no, in my view, the only deep purpose that worked for him was what he called the ethos of Australia, by which, looking at the results in the book, meant he was trying to capture in words the spirit of Australia. In Poor Fellow My Country, he talks about the spirit of what was that? I forget. The spirit of
the rainbow serpent.
No, that's in Poor Fellow My Country.
Okay.
But even back in Capricorn, he's talking about the spirit of Australia. Yes, and there he sort of mythologizes it, or takes the mythology of the Jolly Swagman to capture it. But yeah, in both books, he's trying to express what for him is the essence of being Australian, the essence of this country called Australian, what in sort of modern jargon would be called what is the project of Australia, the ideology of Australia, but that's far too cold a word for me. I think the spirit of Australia, or as he said, the ethos of Australia, is what really brought out the best in him. And of course, it's interesting to compare his view of it in Capricornia. He always wrote best when he felt he had a deep purpose. And I suppose he almost except when he was writing the short stories, he always felt he did have a deep purpose. But the one that really worked for him, judging by the results, was the deep purpose of expressing the truth as he saw it about Australia, the ethos of Australia. I had a lot of trouble intellectually in untangling what seemed to me all kinds of uses of Aborigines and Aboriginality in his two great books. And I think sometimes they are given a too simplistic analysis. On the one level, his books are Dickensian in the sense of being a passionate critique of the treatment of Aboriginals. And I think people forget that he was one of the first writers to make this central to at least one of his books, and it certainly was central to Capricornia. And also Poor Fellow My Country, and it's become more subtle at that point. So certainly one strand of both of those books was a fierce denunciation of Australia for the way it has treated and is still treating the Aboriginal people. That's one side of it. And you could spend hours on discussing all the things that that he has enlightened people about who didn't know much about it in describing what happened to Aboriginals. I mean, one strand of Poor Fellow My Country is all about that stolen generation, because Prindy, the character, is very much one who would have been stolen if he hadn't been someone who kept escaping from those people who tried to steal him. So that's one side of it. But just as important, in fact I think for the novel perhaps even more important, is the many ways in which he used Aboriginality to do things for his novel. One of the things that Aboriginality achieved for Poor Fellow My Country that he really failed at in Soldiers' Women was in providing him with a world within which romance could exist. Because romance can only exist in a world where the numinous is the normal.
Do you want to explain what numinous is?
The numinous being where there are spirits around and active in the world that we in the world acknowledge and feel, and we know that they are there. The numinous, that part of life where it's not all here. People who don't believe in spirits or in spirituality don't believe in the numinous. People who believe that there are ghosts or they're talking to spirits are very much believing in the numinous. Well, and in
How
Rome,
did he do that? How did he introduce
yeah, it well, first of all, he had to choose to make the setting of much of Poor Fellow My Country was to make its setting a world where Aboriginal culture and living was central. So therefore it wasn't the world of Soldiers' Women, which was Sydney, which was a European world. So that's the first thing he had to do. He had to choose to make many of his central characters Aboriginals and to make the world of Poor Fellow My Country a world which was a world of white station owners and small towns and Aboriginals. That was the first thing he did. But having chosen the world, he then had to make it come alive in the novel. And that's where Seven Emus and, to some extent, Soldiers' Women did play an important part, because they showed him how to sort of con a reader, which is what a novelist is always doing. It's persuading you to suspend your disbelief and enter a particular world. In this case, a world which is alien to us because we don't believe that the spirits are all around us. But the Aboriginals did. And it was his job as a novelist to bring us into that world. And he learnt techniques. I'll just talk about one of them. It seems so simple. You think, oh yeah, anyone could do that. But I mean, you've got to think of it. And when you analyse what he did in Seven Emus, what he learnt to do in Seven Emus, then what he did in Poor Fellow My Country, he took Aboriginal Dreamtime stories, and he, like Aboriginals, I believe, do with their young, he gradually initiated the reader of Poor Fellow My Country into Aboriginal culture by telling them a number, not a great number, and that was important to the effect, not a great number, but a number of crucial Aboriginal stories. One of the most important being the creation story, where Kunapipi and Chamala begin their eons-long conflict, living together, sort of. So he told these stories first, and told them well. So you're interested in them as stories in their own right. But then having told them, he then takes important aspects of the story, such as, to give an example that recurs, such as that the spirits of the spirits who are waiting to be born manifest themselves in the curlews. I think he called them quilaks, but I think we would call them curlews, quilak being an Aboriginal name for them. So that, now he tells us the story, that's one stage, but the second stage is to get the reader to the stage where we do get, as readers, where when later on in the book we hear the quilak going quilak, quilak, whatever they do, we as readers at that point have been gradually initiated into actually the position of an Aboriginal, so that when we're reading that book and we hear the quilak screeching, at that point he no longer needs to say anything to us. We at that stage immediately register, the spirit, the young spirits waiting to be born are around. Now how does he do that? Well, I think in two ways. First, he chooses, as I said, not a huge number of elements of Aboriginal law, but very powerful and significant elements of Aboriginal law as they affect his story. He chooses a smallish number, and then he again and again refers to them. And you can almost calibrate it. As the book goes on, the references become less and less detailed, more and more incidental, more and more taken for granted, until, as I say, with each one the point comes where, as a reader, he has seduced you into the position of feeling about the spirit world like Aboriginals feel about the spirit world, in the sense that you just accept them. As readers, you accept them, not as a cute thing that Aboriginals believe, but as something that any reader of this book must believe. In other words, he takes you to a position where you are in a world where romance can occur, because romance depends upon you believing in the possibility of the numinous. So in this world where when Prindy, the young Aboriginal, beautiful Aboriginal romance hero character, wonderful character, when there's a scene in which he is manacled on either side to grown men who are symbols, if you want to sort of limit it to that, but it's far richer than that, of all that's trying to imprison the Aboriginal spirit and all that's trying to imprison the Australian spirit, in fact. And they are taken by this river in flood, swept down the river. Now the river, we the readers know, that the river is not just a river. The river is one of the many guises of Chamala, this spirit of misrule, who is also the spirit of it's a very ambiguous spirit. It's partly negative, partly positive, but it's the spirit that Prindy is associated with in his cult. Anyway, so he's being taken by Chamala, and he's manacled on both sides, and it says that he's brought up against a rock in the middle of the river, which leads down to falls. And this river's in flood. He's a little boy. He's dashed against this rock. Now, in reality, if you were at this point thinking realistically, you'd realise that he would be crushed, wouldn't he? There's no way that he could survive that. But not only does he survive that, he survives with the river in flood pushing against him until these two guys on the either end of him, remember, who dislocating his shoulders, one would imagine, are torn off, and then the river in flood goes down, and Chamala, Prindy, the golden Prindy, then gets up and, having been saved by Chamala, the river, walks off. Now, if you weren't by that time seduced as a reader into the world of romance, you'd just laugh at that. As one does laugh at some of Xavier Herbert's stories, where he is in a much more ham-fisted way writing boy's own type of romance adventure. But you don't laugh, because you know that Prindy is a romance. Well, you don't think of it in those terms as a reader, but as a critic you do, and you know that the reason that as a reader you never laughed at that, I never laughed at that, was because I see Prindy both as a young Aboriginal kid, which he is. For a short period of the book you see him like that. Actually only for a very short period of the book are you allowed to see him like that. For the majority of the book you see him as this like romance. The reason why he worked why Herbert was able to do him was because he almost never takes you inside Prindy. Therefore, he is elusive to you. You if he'd started to try to show what Prindy is thinking, he would immediately have limited him, but he didn't. So where did all that start? I don't know.
Well, I wanted to ask you about Prindy because you actually suggest that Prindy is a symbol for Australia.
Yeah.
At the very end of your book, and I wonder if you could just explain what you mean by that, because that's sort of almost getting to the whole point of what the crux of the matter for Herbert.
Yeah.
Could you explain what his views are?
Yeah. And there is ample evidence for this. I would say there are two sides of the book, and one side of it has Prindy at its centre. That side of it is the romance side. That side of it is the hopeful side. That side of it is the side that pictures an Australia that Herbert has dreamt of, wants to exist, once believed did exist in Capricornia, or was close to existing, now in Poor Fellow My Country no longer believes exists, and no longer almost hopes that it ever will exist, but through the figure of Prindy he pictures what it would be like, and through the romance genre and through the ending of the book he keeps the hope alive, even though he has shown its death through the other character, who is also important, and through the story of the other character, and through the death of the other character, which is De Lacy. Okay, so what evidence that Herbert, to some extent, consciously thought of this. He was, because he knew how important it was for him, having failed in the 50s by being too conscious of the meaning of everything, he himself tried to stop himself often thinking too deeply about what all these people meant. But it's clear that he would have known that he was demonstrating in a variety of ways that Prindy symbolised all that could be best in Australia. Let's have a look at a few of those ways. One way is the way in which he, obviously quite deliberately, linked Prindy in various relationship ways with many of the groups that he thought were important in Australia. Prindy, first of all, was the child of a part Aboriginal girl who would herself have had both white and black in her bloodlines, and an Irish, I think it was Irish, station owner, wasn't it? It was certainly a white man, but I think the Irish came in there. So that was the direct who his parents were. But he then links him to the Indian strand of Australia through making his young sweetheart, was called Savitra, who's the daughter of again, she was a part Aboriginal, I think, and her father was an Indian. Then he has a number of father figures, and interestingly, in all sorts of ways, when Northrop Frye describes the different stages of romance, and I'm pretty sure Herbert would never have read Northrop Frye. So when all these different stages that you read in Northrop, you find them in Poor Fellow My Country. I'm sure it's sort of chance. I mean, here's a guy writing great romance. It's natural that he would fit into what Frye said. Not that he was trying to fit in, but he just would. And one of the things Frye says about romance is that the young hero of romance often has a sort of surrogate father figure, like, for instance, Merlin and King Arthur. Well, Prindy doesn't have just one, he has a number of these surrogate figures at different stages of this very long novel. He's taken under the wing of different people, and each of them represents something. There's Billy Brew, who's the classic Australian knockabout country guy. So he represents that very important side of Australia, the jolly swagman, really. Then there's Savitra's father, that's the Hindu side. Then there's De Lacy himself. The various others who try and I think there are 2 or 3 others that I'm not even thinking about now. But this is another way in which he links.
He also has the old black man, the wisdom god.
Absolutely, yeah. Now those are the two most important. Thank you for reminding me. Not only does he have Bob Wiradirity, who is the most important, and the one who is the one to whom he always turns. In other words, he's the one that Prindy absolutely accepts, which indicates that for Herbert, the central thing about Australia is knowing to know its roots, and to make its roots, and its roots are not its recent roots that may be in Europe, but its roots are in Australia, and the quintessentially Australian root is Aboriginality, and that is what Bob Wiradirity represents. But interestingly, he's not the only Aboriginal who is a mentor to Prindy. There is also King George, who for a time, another Aboriginal oman, who for a time takes Prindy under his wing. It's interesting. I don't think at this point it's interesting to go into that, but there are differences between them. They represent different aspects of Aboriginality.
And a number of women too, who play a role.
They play a role, but they don't take the mentor role. No, it's always the men. I mean, I can't think of even Rivka is the only woman who she takes the role of mother. Yes, you're right. But the other women have no. Prindy never accepts any of the other. So that's one way. Really, that's two ways in which he shows shows Prindy as representative of Australia. There are various other ways. I mean, another way is he takes Prindy in the book on another very romance thing. Goes on a number of different quests. There is a central quest, and the quest of the book is towards initiation into the snake cult of the Aboriginal snake cult, which Bob Wiradiridi is the wise man for. That is the central quest. It's the quest that, if you're going to, every time you talk about it, these things being symbolical, you tend to limit the book because it makes it all sound much too pat, and it's much more like poetry than that. It's much richer than that. But in a sense, you could sort of say if Prindy had ever successfully managed to be initiated, it would have represented that Australia had finally achieved its true self. The fact is, in the book, that quest at least 3 times, I think, he comes close to being initiated. At least 3 times it is stopped, it is disrupted, the initiation ceremony is disrupted by a woman, which is typical of Xavier Herbert, and it is stopped before Prindy can properly be initiated. But
also delays it at the end.
And he stops it, and that's a very, very rich ending, because the meanings of that are really interesting and really rich. But before I get on to that, just as a final way in which Prindy becomes representative of Australia is that apart from this central quest, he goes on a whole range of other journeys. There is the journey in which he travels on his own through the bush. There is the journey where he's taken by an English general out to see the troops out on the islands preparing for the Second World War. There's a journey he's taken up in the aeroplane by Fergus Ferris. There are about 8 or 10 different journeys that he takes, and each of them takes him to a different sort of Australia. And in each of them, as he journeys, as he experiences different aspects of Australia, he sings. So he goes on all these journeys, and not only is he experiencing, and Xavier clearly has chosen these different journeys to let him experience all sorts of different aspects of Australia. And as he, often in the evening, or sometimes during the experiences, Prindy then sings, and it's as if he's singing into a sort of harmony all these disparate aspects of Australia. And this is the one time I'd like to read you a bit of the book for 2 reasons. One, because it beautifully illustrates this point that I made, and second, because there are just a whole number of just marvellous bits of writing. They're always connected, in my view, to the romance side of the book, and they are just wonderful bits of writing, I think. Whether my reading will show that, I don't know. But in this case, one of these journeys, Prindy is, I think it's one of the many times where he's been caught, and he's been taken by the people who are trying to, by the authorities, and he's coming down on the train to Darwin, called, what did he call it in the book? Port Palmerston, I think he called it. And he's on this Port Zodiac, that's right. And there are all these drunkards coming down from out bush. They're coming down and they're all grogged up to the hilt, and they're all singing "Should All Acquaintance Be Forgotten." Some of them start singing the communist anthem and so on.
Red flag.
Yeah. And then you can hear the Aboriginal minga sticks in the background, and you can hear Prindy singing it all into a harmony. It's just this is a highly, I couldn't quote the whole lot because I couldn't in the book, but this is a highly cut version, which is all you'd want to hear anyway at this point. But it gives you the feel of it. Just a marvellous with kangaroos leaping up the hills, going for their lives because of the engines. Boo hoot, boo hoo hoot. then clanging through winding granite cuttings with the sweet wet smoke blotting out the dripping walls and filling the compartment till you coughed to the engine's laboured coughing. Huff, 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 huff. Music in it all to sing to. Click, clack, boo, boo, hoot. Old man kangaroo doing a scoot. Row-holing wheels sigh highland night. All is fair, all is bright. Row-holing wee heel, boo, hoot, a click, clack. The engine need not have stayed there while the prisoners were being transferred to the baggage compartment of the brake van, out of which a bunch of drunk navvies and their swags had been cleared. But it did, while its crew, in full voice, sang The Red Flag. The navvies took up the song. Soon half the train was bawling it. Though cowards cringe and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. Prindy sang it softly to himself, not the words, but the lilt of it. La 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 la. As he knelt, staring out on the miles of sweet picking, where the kangaroos, blue now, and some emus, and Lord Vesey's bulls and cows and calves, and a small herd of buffalo went racing from this hooting, puffing, smoking, disturbing element of man. Piggy wasn't dead, not quite. Chas Chase, who had an ambulance certificate, gave the prognosis that replaced the red flag as the theme of the wheels, when again they got rolling. Poor old Piggy, he won't see the new year in, won't see the new year in, won't see the new year in. The murdered country fell behind. The drunks snored. Grandfather Trotter stared and stared at his first glimpse of eternity. All water now ran eastward. Prindy shifted to that side to watch it vanish like swift-moving snakes into the greenery. Now he was singing to the song of the wheels. He won't see the new year in. I just think that is sometimes in a way when you read it, some of it's lost, but it's the incongruity of it all. For Prindy, everything in Australia is acceptable. It can all be sung into a harmony. I mean, the red flag, this old drunken old man who happens to be his grandfather, although he doesn't know it. Piggy Trotters happens to be his grandfather. The drunks. I know when I carried on writing that part of the book, I pointed out that people like Rivka, they get really angry when they're caught and brought back. They get really angry about things in Australia. Prindy never gets angry about anything. Anything is grist to his mill. Anything is possible to work into Australia. But your original question was, why is Prindy a symbol of Australia? And perhaps most of all, it's for this reason that you see him. Another lovely example is when Marizik, the cardinal, bishop or whoever he is, wants to turn Prindy into a little Catholic, which is another way in which he's shown to be an element of Australia, because everyone who comes into contact with him wants to make him into whatever they most believe in. Someone who's an electrician thinks he's going to make the best electrician in the world. Cahoon, who's the policeman who's often trying to catch him, also loves him. Also thinks he's his son. Wants to turn him into the best policeman.
Native policeman.
Best native policeman. So, but whenever Prindy is contacts anyone, like when he's turned into a Catholic now, Rivka, being a Jewess, fiercely resists anything that would attack her Jewishness. You'd think that Herbert, and if he'd been writing in Soldiers' Women mode, I'm sure that his mind would have told him Prindy should resist anything that goes against his Aboriginal centrality. And therefore he should resist Catholicism. But because this other aspect, this sort of more inspired part of Herbert was as he sensed, obviously, I'm only guessing here, but he must have sensed that it was right for Prindy to be perfectly happy to accept Catholicism for a time. For him, it was all good, as he called it, business. The sort of religious rituals of Chamala were not negated or put down by this. It was all a part of Australia. And so whenever he's caught by somebody, Rivka gets annoyed, but Prindy accepts it all. As far as he's concerned, as a romance character, his quest carries on. It doesn't matter if humans stop it here or stop it there. It still goes on and on and on.
So is that why in your book you argue that in fact that Herbert, even though he was pessimistic about Australia in Poor Fellow My Country, that he in fact had maintained a view that allowed for, you know, renewal, if you like,
yeah.
and that there's still a possibility for Australia, if it takes note of the Aboriginals, I guess, foundation of Australia, that something really beautiful can happen here. Is that what you're trying to get at? I think in your book.
Look,
because everyone dies in the end. I mean,
yeah.
people get eaten by crocodiles, and
yeah.
it on the surface, at one level, it looks terrible, doesn't
yeah.
it?
Yeah. Two answers to that. I mean, the first simple answer is yes, but before we go to that, I just want to clarify something. I never got to say that you've got to see this Aboriginal centrality of Australia, and Prindy being central to it, as simply that the Aboriginal and Aboriginality is the most powerful symbol of something quintessentially Australian. He's not saying anything as simplistic through the novel as we have to go back to our Aboriginals to learn how to be Australians. I mean, I don't think he, in fact, I would argue, and this would probably be one of the more contentious of my positions, is that the Aboriginal question, in the sense of being that the role of Aboriginals in Australia and all the injustices and what can Aboriginals do to lift their whole nation out of the pit into which they've been sunk by the role of white people.
Yeah, colonisation.
I think that has become much less important. It is much less important in Poor Fellow My Country. It's there, but it's much less important in Poor Fellow My Country than is Aboriginals and Aboriginality as symbols of something quintessentially Australian. So I just want to make that's my position on that. Now, to go to your main question, the answer to that, yes, there was still hope, and he himself said this in some of his own commentary on the book, and I don't always agree with his own commentary on his own books, but I do agree with this. He said somewhere something like he hoped that through this book he would awaken Australia and Australians to become who they should have become, could have become. So he said it outside the book. Inside the book, he says it's through, and this again is part of the marvellous successfulness of his mixing of these four genres, which has never been properly acknowledged or generally acknowledged. Because he takes the genre of the novel and he tells one story there, and it has one ending, and it's a marvellous ending. And I think that there are not all that many really successful writers of tragedy, but in this one book he actually has written a great tragic ending, and that is the death of the novel hero, who is De Lacy. And the nature of that ending, I call it tragic because for me one of the definitions that I find helpful in tragic is that there is something inevitable about it, that play it again and it would always end in that way, and you can't blame the characters, that's just the way it was. And the ending of De Lacy is, he is the man who of all whites in the book has tried hardest to open himself to Australia, and that means opening himself to Aboriginal culture and opening himself to the idea that Aboriginals have a great culture and they shouldn't be pressured into living a white culture. They should be encouraged and supported in continuing to live their own culture. He has been the man who's been fighting for this all through the book and trying to live by it all through the book and trying to make himself very much the grandfather of Prindy, the symbol of true Australia. Interestingly, Prindy never quite accepts him as that. That's part of his de Lacy's tragedy. Anyway, and we get to this final scene where Prindy has been put into a position where his own great mentor, Bob Wiradjuri, has had to allow a trial of by the final attempt at initiating Prindy has failed because it has been interrupted by Savitra, this little Hindu girl who is his girlfriend, and any woman interfering in such a cult event is immediately brutally raped and killed, which has happened, but the whole thing must be purified by Prindy having an ordeal that involves the men who were meant to initiate him launching spears at him with full force, and he has a boomerang to deflect the spears. Presumably if he deflects them all, then he is purified. But if one of them gets through, as in our own European trials by combat, then... So that's the situation. De Lacy hears enough to know that Savitra's gone where she's gone. He goes to where he knows the initiation is taking place. He's been in favour of it, of course, but he feels he knows what will happen if Savitra goes in. So De Lacy goes to see what he can do to prevent disaster. And he says as he goes, I know that I normally want to leave them to get on with their own business, but this time I must do something. And I'll take a gun just in case I can't do it by the normal Aboriginal way of payment of goods and so on, then I will have to come the white man over them to stop anything awful happening. So very well-meaning, he sets off. He's met by Bob Wiradjuri, this absolutely marvellous character, I think. Again, just a man who is pictured as scrawny old Aboriginal who most whites in the towns would look down their noses upon and shy away from, and yet with this dauntless refusal to be put down by white society and this absolute dignity which always makes De Lacy, in every scene they appear together, De Lacy is the suppliant and Bob Wiradjuri is visually, Bob Wiradjuri is the vagrant derelict, but in every other way he is the master. And Bob Wiradjuri meets him and very politely says to him, there's a lovely dialogue between them, and De Lacy explains what he's come for, and Bob Wiradjuri says, actually he doesn't so much say, he does something. He turns his spear round and he draws a line in the sand. And he says to De Lacy, you know what that line means? And De Lacy does know what that line means. It means that the line extends to infinity, and that he, De Lacy, is not allowed to cross over it. That's what Aboriginal culture tells him. And Bob Wiradjuri goes back. And there's a moment of choice, and this is the tragic moment and here's where the failure comes in, because the white man, as in many other ways the book has shown, the white man we haven't even talked about the ecological disasters. That is one aspect of the way that white men have not come to terms with Australia. But encapsulated in this story now, and this hero now, this is the moment of truth when he's brought up against, this is what Australian culture says. You do not cross this line. but his white man's way says, I must cross it. I would never forgive myself if something happened to these two children, Prindy and Savitri. If I didn't step in, I must do it. And that's what I said is tragic about it. Yeah, of course he must do it, because this is what Herbert is picturing here is not bad people doing bad things in Australia. He's picturing awful impossibilities, incompatibilities are creating. Anyway, he crosses the line. He sees what's happening. He comes over into the ring place where they are, and he sees Prindy fending off, and he sees one of the guys launching his spear, and he sees Prindy's boomerang coming down and deflecting the spear, and he sees another guy, and there are 3 or 4 or 5 more still to go, and he can see that Prindy is tiring, and he shouts out to the men to stop it, and of course tragically his shout disturbs Prindy's concentration, which wavers, and the next spear, because of the shout, the next spear goes through Prindy, and that's the death of Prindy. And De Lacy fires his gun into the air, scatters the men, except for Bob Wiradjuri, and runs across to take Prindy in his arms. And as he runs, he passes Bob Wiradjuri and shouts angrily at him, "What were you thinking of doing? Why didn't you protect him?" And he gets to Prindy, and as he gets to Prindy, he knows that Bob Wiradjuri is coming, and he suddenly feels Bob Wiradjuri's spear going into De Lacy's back, through his kidneys or whatever. And the spear thrust kills him, but not immediately. And he turns to Bob Wiradjuri and says, "What are you doing that for?" And in the short dialogue between them, before De Lacy dies, Bob Wiradjuri, he says, "Why didn't you protect De Lacy?" De Lacy says, "Why didn't you protect Prindy?" And Bob Wiradjuri says, "I did protect him." And in the dialogue you find out that the boomerang was not any old boomerang. This was Bob Wiradjuri's special magic boomerang. Not in it, that sounds trivial, but a boomerang that had the power to protect Prindy from those spears. Now we as reader by that point, we can believe that. But De Lacy, as an ordinary, however well-meaning white man, couldn't believe it, didn't even then presumably believe it. Who knows, maybe he did at that point. I think I say in my book that he must have known that it was true then. And there's the tragedy of the failure. But now, the end, that's not the end of the book. It sounds like a great scene to end on, but it's not the end of the book, because the end of the book is when in fact we've gone even lower than the end. I'm spoiling it for you. Gosh, you haven't even read it yet. I know this, but it's a wonderful scene. Anyway, and then there seems to be a real anticlimax, because for the next number of pages it shows modern Australia. Lily Lagoons has become a uranium mine, and the whole and the underground magic river has been exposed by the blasting and has dried out, and everything is bleak and modern Australian and hopeless, and Rivka has become a gaunt old woman, and she's trogging around the country with old Pat, Hanahan, whatever his name is, and they're just a sort of rat-bag laughing stock to everyone. So it is absolute failure. Hannaford. Absolute failure, And so we've had the tragic death and then what it's led to. But he doesn't end the book there. We have a scene at the very end which as I haven't talked about his uses all through his career of repetition, but they are many and varied and often very, very successful. And here again, he repeats the earlier scene where De Lacy is chucked in Sydney. De Lacy and Alfie are chucked. Well, Alfie is manhandled and De Lacy is chucked into Sydney Bay by irate people who support conscription. I think that's what it is. In this final scene, Pat Hannaford and Rivka are equally manhandled because Rivka, I think it's one of the minor royals, has come to talk to the people out in the bush, you know, where out in Beatrice River, and Rivka raises her voice in talking about the Aboriginals and how they should be given their own land and allowed to live their own lives on their own land and so on. And she cuts in on the minor royal in saying this, who's obviously Prince Charles, I think, in the book. And of course the Australian crowd are incensed that someone should cut in on a minor British royal, and they take Pat Hannaford, who tries to protect Rivka when the crowd comes in on her, and they take him and they throw him down the embankment, and he goes into the river, and because he's crippled, Rivka knows that he will drown, and so she goes in after him. And again, it could be such a in his early writing this would have been pure ham sentimentality, but in fact it's not. As she then drowns, and as she drowns she sees the crocodile in the river. She just sees the eyes and the snout. Quadremigal, he uses these long words, but I think it refers to the two eyes and the snout of the crocodile. And she sees this great crocodile, and she's in the river, which is one of Chamela's shades, and the crocodile is another of Chamela's shades. And so it's suddenly, as he describes it in the final 2 pages, suddenly what he calls the moa, the mystery, the numinousness of Aboriginal Australia, suddenly the magic is back in the world, and this is no longer a crocodile, and this is no longer just even Chamela, because she sees something like, there's a reference to, was it the grey eyes that she sees, and then her cry, her dying cry as she goes down, taken by the crocodile and by the river, is she cries out Prindy's name. And clearly in the world of romance, the Prindy spirit, crocodile, Chamela, river, still lives on and takes the other symbol, and she's the hardest to explain symbol, and Herbert didn't really quite understand. Somehow Rivka becomes a kind of parallel symbol. I don't even want to try to explain it, because I think you really need to read the book to explain, because it's like the subtlety of some poems that you can't really explain it without trivializing it. But these two symbols within the genre of romance of the great beauty and richness and promise of Australia, something as Herbert thought when he started writing Capricornia, something quite unique in the world. He thought Australia was, the promise of Australia was something that no other country offered to the world in the way that Australia did. And yes, they die, but romance heroes do die in romance, and they are born again. And they, somewhere in the book, I think it talks about Bob Wiradiri being restored up into the stars. So the ending. So there are 2 endings of the book. There is the tragic ending, and then there's this nasty little flat spot where you see modern Australia in all its horribleness. And then you have, in the final, I think it's just 3 pages, he takes up again the romance, which you think has ended with the death of, but no, that was just Prindy within the world of the novel dying. But now we get Prindy within the world of romance, and we get the romance heroine joining him in that world, and that's Rivka. And they both die, but romance draws upon, as Poor Fellow My Country in many scenes draws upon some of the oldest of the regeneration myths, where, as many people will know, in many traditional cultures, there are myths that repeat, that we have actually in our own Christian myth of Christ, where the king is sacrificed or else dies willingly, and in order to be born again in the new year and regenerated in the new year. And there is the power of that myth lies behind the ending of the romance of Poor Fellow My Country. And it is powerful. And so yes, Herbert wrote a book in which he could express everything he felt about Australia, and that everything included both a deep pessimism on the way things are going and the way he thought things would go, but also an equally passionate hope that the beauty that he saw in Australia's potential was still possible, and that is actually where he chose to end the book. I think he actually ends on the word "Poor Fellow My Country" to remind us that it is just a hope, but it is a hope, and it's a very rich one.
You've got this side too to...
Oh, right.
It was a councillor of the Gwynedd Shire who brought Xavier Herbert out here. And he told me the purpose of his visit was to psych the place out, to see whether he would like to come back here because he'd been here as a small child. In fact, he did say he was born here. And it was quite an occasion. I had 2 grandchildren with me, and he spent quite a lot of time talking to them. They thought it was marvellous to meet a man who'd written books like he.
Would you like to tell? Yeah.
And my granddaughter suddenly remembered that we had roses to plant in a rose garden that had just been arranged, and she had to go 2 miles down the road, get her father to bring some earth up because it hadn't been properly filled in. And Xavier planted the first rose in our garden. 2 years later, a young lady came on a bus tour here, and she said she had been sent by Xavier Herbert to see if I was looking after his rose.
And what did you think of that?
Was that all right?
Yes. What did you think of that? Him sending someone to check on the roses?
Well, I thought it was a wonderful thing to think that he thought so much of it. I think he had really honest, happy feelings of seeing where he was supposed to be born.
My name's Gerald Frape. I was a journalist in 1976 with a magazine called The Bush Telegraph, and I was interviewing people who I considered to be iconic Australian individual Republicans, and Xavier Herbert, of course, was one of the prime examples of this kind of people. And I went to Queensland University to interview him, and I remember very clearly meeting a rather cantankerous, restless, edgy Xavier Herbert, who, upon meeting me, suggested we have a cup of tea and that I would make the cup of tea. and that he insisted that I warm the pot and that I turned the teapot 3 times before we actually drank the tea, and that I remember that he had honey in his tea for his arthritis.
Mm-hmm. And do you want to describe what he was like at the time in terms of his physical health, maybe?
At the time, I remember meeting Xavier Herbert. He was fairly crippled by the arthritis. He had difficulty in moving around, and that's why I was making the cup of tea for him. But he was still that sort of restless energy that he had that sort of made you feel on edge or alive. I can remember he was very interested in the magazine that I was doing, which was another attempt in a long lineage of Australian publishing failures to sort of promote an independent, pluralistic Australia. And he was very interested in that. And he said to me, was I getting any money from the government for it? And he suggested that we should ring up Neville Wran and ask him for some money for it. He then went on to tell me a story that he had actually contacted Gough Whitlam after he'd lost power in 1975 and suggested that he join with Xavier and form the Commonweal of Australia Party. And he was really upset that in what he told me, that Gough hadn't even written back to him, hadn't even acknowledged the fact that he'd made this offer to Gough to leave the Labor Party and join his Commonwealth of Australia Party.
So you had an interview with Xavier. How long did the interview take? Do you remember what he covered and how long it took?
Well, it was an interview that I chose to do in a certain style, where I had some questions that I wanted to ask him, but when I published the interview, I published it pretty much just as his words were spoken to me, slightly edited, of course, but I did that because I wanted to create a style in my interviews where I had as little interference from me as the reporter as possible, and where I allowed the person that I was interviewing to tell their story. At the front of the story, I had a short sort of introduction to the interview to give you a bit of a flavour of what the person was like, but essentially the interview itself was a question-answer style that tried to allow the interviewee to have that person's say.
And he talked about his, in the interview, he talked about his childhood and youth in Western Australia and how it influenced his views.
Yeah, I got the impression very clearly from him that his experience in the early days of Australia was one of a very colonial Australia, an Australia that looked to Britain, but that he early on had picked up that we were really, or we should really be, a republic. And in a sense, I was attracted to interviewing him because I'd read Capricornia and Poor Fellow My Country. And for me, my take out of it was here was a writer who had this sort of romantic vision of Australia, as I interpreted it, as a Creole nation, which I found to be very interesting because I felt that Capricornia was putting the view that we could have possibly been a country that blended the indigenous with the European settlers, and we would have been this very interesting country that was in touch with the spirit of the land. And I think that's something that Xavier, to me, really exhibited very strongly in his writing and in his belief system, because even that romantic notion of Gough Whitlam coming and joining him for the Commonweal of Australia Party, he actually said to me at the time, he said, we should think like this. We should think that if there's a problem, say, in Broken Hill, that we would all go over and help Broken Hill. So he had this kind of very romantic vision of Australia as a country that sort of still lived according to the spirit of the land of Australia being a place where we helped each other out. And he visioned that as a sort of a blending of the indigenous with the European, and he visioned that as this commonweal, for the sort of common good of Australia.
In the interview, he also talks about he writing about lousy Aussies. Would you like to explain what he meant by lousy Aussies?
Yes, he strongly identified with Frank Hardy as a writer, and he strongly disidentified with Patrick White, who he saw as British almost, and who he called an objective writer about Australia, where he and Hardy, he saw them as being involved with Australians and in fact hating Australians to some degree, being cranky with Australians, who he called lousy Aussies, but he also put himself and Hardy in that category of also being lousy Aussies. And he said that this was because he was deeply involved with them. That's why he could call them lousy Aussies and call himself a lousy Aussie. And that's why he and Hardy hated Australians, in a sense. He was putting hated in inverted commas. But that Patrick White just sort of had contempt for them because he stood above them, whereas he and Hardy were down there mixing it with them. And in a sense, you get that from his writing as well, that he travelled around the country, he moved around the country, he moved with all kinds of Australian people, Indigenous people, European settlers, and in some ways his rheumatoid arthritis was a source of great sort of conflict for him because he couldn't move about anymore. And he also had this great sense of sort of foreboding of his own demise, of his own mortality. And in fact, he said to me that he'd always predicted that he would die in 1976. And he spent some time in the interview talking about how he was a registered druggist and he knew how to take his life, and that if the time came, it became intolerable to live how he was living, he would do this.
Yeah, he also mentions going out into the desert too, doesn't he? Even in as early as 1976.
Yeah, he had this... he definitely had this, what I'd call this Aboriginal or Indigenous spirit about him. And obviously through his connections with Indigenous and his support for Indigenous people in Australia, he'd obviously absorbed a lot of their teachings and their learnings and their culture. And in fact, you know, that's what he was saying. I'm going to be like the old Indigenous person who knows when their time is up, I will just go out into the bush or into the desert and I'll just pass away. I'll just die of natural causes.
You also talked with him about the swagman spirit, if you like, the Australian kind of, I don't know, he not rebellion, but a kind of identification with the underdog against the colonialists, which he also identified in Australia, that there was this colonial group who were coming in and just exploiting the country, taking out, you know, everything they could get from a materialist point of view. Would you like to comment about that?
Yeah, part of what really attracted me to want to interview him, because he represented an Australian who basically was an outsider in a way in Australia. And to be an outsider in Australia is a difficult road to walk. And that I was curious to know what he thought about the Australian sort of spirit, in a sense, in terms of rebelliousness. And in fact, he again brought it back to the lousy Aussie idea, that really he felt they were very supine people, he called them. They were the most unrebellious people, and they identified with an old swagman. And he said how pathetic that was, in a sense, that was their act of rebellion. And he said, in fact, that, you know, there'd never been a rebellion that lasted more than about 10 minutes in Australia. And he was very disparaging of Australians' view of themselves as rebellious people. But basically he saw them as people who were sort of willing to sort of lie down in the face of authority, but had this romantic image, or what you might call a sentimental kind of attachment to the underdog, to the swaggy, to the person who was, you know, fighting against the squatters, but who in actual fact just went along with them. And that was also a source of his, again, of his cantankerous crankiness with Australians. He was generally pissed off about Australians, I think, in lots of ways. And I felt that was really interesting because he reflected, I think, that crossover from the Indigenous people and those Australians who felt to be outsiders within Australia. And I think he actually gave voice, to, in an early stage, a voice to the Indigenous people of Australia by being a voice for that pissed offness.
I think we've covered just about everything I wanted to cover. Is there any final comments you wanted to make, Gerald, about your experience, even however brief, with Xavier as a journalist? Maybe the political context that you were interviewing him in. This was 1976. So, do you remember what it was like at that time? This was after Whitlam had been removed.
The time that I interviewed Xavier was post 1975, when Whitlam had been removed from power. It was a period of time where anyone who was involved with the left centre was pretty disillusioned. Again, no news to Xavier, actually. He'd been living with this for years, so he was a natural person for me to go to interview. I can always remember, and I still remember to this day, the kind of energy that he had, the kind of cantankerous, angry sort of energy that he had, that sort of made you feel really alive, and he was really alive. And there's a beautiful photo we took of him, my photographer took of him at the time, that really captured that in his head. He was this large head, this man that had these big ideas and was passionate and was fighting still for his ideas, even though his body was sort of not doing what he wanted it to do and not being able to move around as he was used to. I think that he was a spirit that gave support to the outsider in Australia, and that was very attractive to me, because I knew that Australians tend to be a fairly mainstream people. They tend to be a fairly mediocre, middle ground people, and that to be on the perimeters of that was a dangerous place to be. And I think he embodied that a lot, and he gave voice to that a lot.